This debt crisis does have a monetary crisis. It does have a currency crisis. Inflation is an invisible tax on the poor and the working poor in the middle class. And in the social unrest, the polarization, anyone listening to this in Canada, the United States is familiar with it. There's polarization also in Germany, and there's polarization in France, and there's polarization in Eastern Europe. So again, I'm not making this up. We all kind of know it. But, politics is an extension of economics, and military, as Clausewitz says, an extension of failed politics, and we have it in a blender. We've got a financial and monetary and currency crisis globally. We have a debt crisis globally. We have social unrest pretty much globally. It's a very different year for Trump to be elected, probably, and we'll talk about that in 2024 than it was in 2016. We've got recession in Germany and China and the UK. We've got political stress, social stress. It's all in a blender, and it's all tied together. And the implications, regardless of who wins in November, are pretty obvious to me. And we'll get into that. But I think right now, and I'm not trying to be partisan, but what we just saw the other day in Pennsylvania, look, you don't need to be a political pundit to know that the image of Trump fist pumping with blood on his face and the American flag behind him and a blue sky is more iconic in a lot of ways than the flag at Iwo Jima. And I think the contrast to that with, poor Biden introducing Zelensky as Putin in a just absolutely failed debate, that combination, Trump is looking at least far more presidential. Again, regardless of your politics, we can all left or right see that. And, with Bill Ackman and how Elon Musk supporting Trump, it's the current in Trump's favor. We have to be honest and realistic about. And typically, historically, when there's an incumbent, they usually win the White House if the markets are up at least an average of 9%. And this year, the U.S. markets are up over 18%. But the obvious elephant in the room, or donkey in the room, with Biden and his performance and what's happening politically in the U.S., we can't ignore it. So we have to think about what a Republican president means and what a Trump presidency could mean for the markets going forward, credit, equities, etc. But I think, without trying to be sensational, right now, as it stands as of this day, that Trump is going to be pretty hard to beat. Not just that, just the polling and the fiasco in the debate. I think it's hard, it's hard for anyone. And again, I'm not trying to be encouraging to Democrats or more liberal thinkers in the U.S. or anywhere in the world. I can understand a lot of the frustrations people have with Trump, but Biden, you can't Chris Cuomo this, you can't George Clooney this. The world's seen his decline mentally. The joke was he's a standing example of the 25th Amendment. His mental condition is a problem. Now, there are those who would prefer anything over Trump, including another 4 years of Biden and Harris, or whoever comes in at the DNC. But I think without trying to be pro-Trump or anti-Biden, and I know that's hard because people will think there's a bias, but I think you can be relatively objective. Even the Democrats are extremely worried about Biden's ability to serve. So we have to think honestly about what a Trump presidency will mean for the markets. I don't think that's a stretch right now. Look, I've called it the DSA, the Dis-United States of America. And again, that's not being politically biased. Anyone, left or right or center, in the U.S. would agree that we're not the United States. We're not a united country right now. It's very polarizing. It's a consequence of a lot of things. What we can do, I think, is be realistic. I can be Pollyannish and say we can hope for a better united America with better policies, better honesty, better candor on our debt situation, our monetary situation. We can hope for a better leader. Again, whether Biden or Trump wins, half the country is going to be extremely unhappy. And the violence we're seeing, again, we don't know enough about it. There's hardly any reason to get into a conspiracy theory. It's the violence we're seeing, not surprising though, because there are many who see Trump as Hitler 2.0, or a fascist. And there are many who see just the opposite. They see that in the Biden actions of the DOJ and the weaponization of the media and the weaponization of politics and the courts. Again, depending on your bias or your position, you can make a clear case that both parties are guilty of it. But regardless of whatever your view is on politics, and just the fact that we have to caveat this conversation so carefully about who wins in 24, because we're going to upset half the audience, is a testament to how divided we are. But again, what can we really do? I think we can prepare for more social unrest, because we're going to prepare for more inflation, a more debt-based kind of, not the end of the USA or the end of the empire, but a very difficult USA and a very difficult economic setting in the world. Again, whether I was in Istanbul or South Africa or London or Paris or here in Spain, everyone feels it, rich and poor. Everyone feels the economic stress. What we're seeing in the US right now is the ramifications, the ripple effects of that economic stress affecting political views in a very, very polarized country. And again, in terms of the markets, we can make some predictions right now, and we should. But to answer the question, Dave, what can we do? I don't have an easy answer. And I've joked it, my take is whether we have Papa Smurf, Mother Teresa, or Albert Einstein in the White House, or Donald Trump or Biden, you're not going to be able to ward off the inevitable economic events that are going to happen post-2024, maybe even before the election. I don't think anyone can solve this problem, the debt problems that we have. And we can go into each of those sectors from, equities, credits, the Fed, rates, inflation, currency debasement. This is just, no one can solve this right now. We've passed that Rubicon, but we can certainly make a few minor predictions about what will happen if Trump is in the White House. First, to take Trump out of the equation, just look at a Republican versus a Democratic White House. I mean, traditionally, typically, a Republican White House is more market friendly. And, Biden has openly said, I'm the poorest of the 100 senators because I've never owned a stock, or I don't have a stock portfolio. I'm more interested in labor, the middle class. That's the argument. Republicans in general tend to be more market focused. But if you look at Trump in particular, because he is the Republican nominee, and J.D. Vance is now, as like a half hour ago, the vice president, Trump is going to be clearly pro M&A. He's going to be pro stock market. I mean, I think he must have tweeted over 150 times during his first term that the market is a barometer for his popularity. And he was always tweeting throughout his administration that the markets are up since my election. And that's some truth to that. I mean, Trump, we can expect from a Trump White House, he's no fan of regulations, so we're going to see financial regs loosen. I think we'll see he's very pro oil and gas, so those restrictions on liquid natural gas exports will probably be removed. He's going to be less restrictive on big tech. He's got the trade wars with China. That's going to be tough globally. He's definitely going to be pro tax cutting. And I think if you look at that, that's kind of future things that we can predict based on what he said and what he's done in the past. And even history, David, I mean, in 2016, when elected, markets kind of went down for about 2 hours and they ripped north. In the first 30 days, the markets were up 5% based on this kind of pro-business Trump mentality. And then despite, trade wars and despite impeachments and despite all that, markets saw record highs under the first Trump administration. So I think the markets are pricing in a more market-friendly White House. And, in his first term, we saw higher market rises than we saw even in Obama's first term. So there was an optimism around Trump, whether there's a correlation between Trump and markets rising directly or whether it's Fed policy is a larger debate. But even tech surged over 150% in his term. So if you look at that history under Trump, you could say history repeats itself. I would say it's a very different world in 2024 than 2016. It's a very different debt world. It's a very different rate market right now. We were still at zero interest rate policy in 2016. Now we've got a Fed that's very hawkish. We've got global crises, again, I said in Europe and elsewhere with recession. So it's not the same America. It's not the same rate market. It's not the same debt market. And it's certainly not the same social setting that we saw in 2016. And again, I'm going to say this flippantly. I don't think you could have Papa Smurf in the White House, Santa Claus. You could have anyone in the White House. They can't avoid the realities that we're seeing in the credit markets, the equity markets, the debt markets. And again, it's not a gold bug, sensational negativity. I know that's something we have to always apologize for. But again, you can talk to Jeffrey Gundlach. He says we're walking straight into a credit implosion. He is a bond king for a reason. He looks at these things. You can talk to Jeremy Grantham at GMO, a man I've invested with. He certainly knows equity risks. You can talk to Thomas Hernig, the former Kansas City president of the Fed. He pretty much vetoed everything that was voted there. He was very much the only sole voice of reason at the Fed. But he says we're just one banking crisis away from more QE. And again, that banking crisis, this is from a Fed president in Kansas City, a very honest, good person. That banking crisis is based on over $600 billion in underwater U.S. Treasury collateral and trillions in non-performing loans under this higher for longer policy at the Fed. So again, these are not gold bug sensational things. You can talk to former Fed officials, you can talk to the bond kings, you can talk to equity experts. And I think, again, the banking crisis is another risk. So again, whether Biden or Trump or someone else is in the White House, these problems don't go away longer term. Short term, we're probably going to see markets react positively to a Republican in general and Trump in particular. I think we can expect that. Again, we're still months away from what happens there. We still have a currency crisis. We still have an inflation crisis, and we still have $35 trillion in debt. We've got a CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is promising another $20 trillion in debt in the next 10 years. I mean, we've got global debt at 400 trillion. We've got global M2 up 5x in the last 20 years, diluting the currencies. Our current interest expense on our treasury is 1.6 trillion a year. That's twice our military budget. Neil Ferguson, Luke Gromen, others have said, when you get to that type of distortion where your interest expense is twice your military budget, clearly your wars or proxy wars or direct or indirect wars have bankrupted your country. So again, very sensational, lots of numbers, lots of data. We can all interpret that data differently, but I interpret that as being, to Gundlach's point and Groman's and others, we're walking into, not just potentially, we are already in a credit implosion and a debt crisis. Military budgets, protectionism, environmental issues, social unrest, COVID, all these crises, they're very real and they certainly affect debt, but the real crisis existed long before COVID, long before ESG became the headline du jour, long before this political arrest. We had a debt problem clearly in motion. And we had a debt problem because central banks were supporting whoever was in power to monetize that debt and destroy the currency. The US dollar relatively stronger than others, but the real problem, ironically, is the mother of all central banks of the BIS, including the individual running it. And the real problem is the central bankers who, yes, they may have had pressure to keep monetizing that debt, and you can blame the Congress or the legislature for creating that debt. But the real problem existed long before these quote unquote headlines, long before Ukraine, long before COVID. We saw this in 2019 when the repo market crunched and they didn't trust each other's collaterals among the big banks. We saw the bailouts that the Fed did, backdoor QE. We're seeing that right now with supplementary leverage ratios. I'm not trying to just take away the sins of the central banks, but we've seen a debt crisis before all the headlines that the BIS is now blaming. We saw these problems long before COVID hit the headlines, long before the bank failures of 2023, long before we weaponized the US dollar in 2022 against a major nuclear power already in bed with a major oil importer, and we've sanctioned the world's greatest oil exporter. We created so many shots in our own feet, in our own chest, in our own temple, long before these BIS or Fed apologists can now come up with some excuse. And again, watch what the world is doing, not what they're saying. Watch what they're doing with the dollar. Watch what they're doing with the oil markets. Watch what they're doing to monetize the bond markets. They are desperate and they're running out of tricks to buy time. And again, I can't predict the Mugs game when it blows, but from Gundlach to Jeremy Grantham to Thomas Hernig, I'm on the same page, to Luke Gromen. This is not sustainable and this is not fixable by anyone, left or right or center, in the White House in November. They will have to cut rates because they can't afford higher for longer across the board, from Japan to DC, from Tokyo to GC. They can't afford these higher rates. They can't afford a stronger dollar. But what does that mean? Cutting rates buys time, but it still debases the dollar. It's inflationary inherently. It will ultimately mean that they can solve a problem. Technically, you can have deficits without tears if you monetize every debt. Yeah. But you can even make the S&P immortal, that it could never go down, or every dip can be captured or saved. But you do that at the expense of the currency. And again, this is not just history repeating itself in rhyming. This is how all debt-soaked nations, empires, oligarchies, monarchies, democracies fail. They don't disappear. Their currencies don't disappear, but this is how they fail. And the dollar may fail last, to Brent Johnson's point, but it's failing because the only way, since we're not going to get the productivity and the tax receipts anytime soon to solve this problem, and we're not going to cut military spending, we're not going to cut entitlements and Medicare and Social Security, that's political suicide. The only way to sustain this circus, this magic show, is at the expense of the currency. And again, that's why I became a gold investor instead of a risk asset investor. I have nothing against speculation. I have nothing against the returns you can get on the S&P to fight inflation. I have nothing against looking for risk or going further on that risk branch for yield that doesn't really exist. But yes, it's inflate or die now. And you can mess interest rates, you can play with that, but you can also play with the fiction that we're beating inflation by lying about inflation. I know that sounds sensational, but we are. And the reason they're using PCE instead of CPI is it's a little more rigged, a little more easy to trick, and it's a little bit closer to 2% than the CPI. But all of that we've talked about in the past. The net is very simple. All broke nations debase their currency to stay elected. And whether that's left, right, or center, I don't see any exception around that. And that's why gold is hitting all-time highs. That's why the world is turning away from the US dollar. That's why the petrodollar is not dying, but it's changing. And that's why China is buying oil in yuan, and Russia's converting that into buying goods in China that were once made in America, and then that's settling in gold. And that's why since 2014, central banks in the East are dumping US IOUs and stacking physical gold. You don't have to be a gold bug to see what the world is doing, not what they're saying. And they're using the US dollar as they're really using as a liquidity asset, but they're using gold as a reserve asset. And the BIS that you just quoted just made physical gold a tier 1 asset last year. These are not coincidences that the world since 2022 does not trust the US Treasury, does not trust the US dollar as much as it did prior to sanctions. I think if you wanted to destroy America quicker, you would put someone who would make a decision to sanction Russia. That was, I can't believe we did that. Again, pro or left, Biden or anti-Biden, that was such a watershed moment in 2022 in Q1. As big a watershed as, the fall of 1971, we got off the gold standard. Again, I'm not alone in this. Fed officials, certainly Grant Williams and others, Luke Gromen, that was so obvious to see that once we did that, trust in the US dollar and the US IOU was going to get even worse. Because you don't want to weaponize world reserve currency. You want a neutral reserve currency. And now with Saudi Arabia and the UAE slowly, not overnight, as I said over 2 years ago, slowly moving away from the dollar, slowly catching on that the U.S. Treasury doesn't give what it used to do. The U.S. dollar has lost 98% since we started the petrodollar story. The world is going away to dollar as base money and energy as base money, and that they're seeing these oil trade and they're seeing this net settlement in gold among the BRICS, which is membership is rising. All these things are tied together: debt, de-dollarization, currency debasement, politics, social unrest, inflation, currency debasement. This is not a gold bug argument anymore. Look at what the world is doing, not what they're saying.